Alien Girl watched the human hold the ridge alone. His reason for staying shifted something in her. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main character. David Miller stood at the edge of the cliff, his gaze fixed on the valley below, the wind whipping through his dark blonde hair. The snow was coming down harder now, the icy flakes stinging his face like tiny needles. The temperature was far below freezing, and yet, David remained there, unmoving, his hands gripping the edge of the ridge. The mission was simple: hold this position for 24 hours, no matter the cost. But as the hours passed, the air grew heavier, and the cold began to settle deep into his bones. He was alone, surrounded by nothing but the endless snow and the howling wind. To an outsider, it might seem like madness. Why would anyone willingly stay in such a harsh, unforgiving environment? But to David, it wasn't just a test of endurance, it was his duty. He had a job to do, and failure wasn't an option. The thin, harsh atmosphere made it difficult to breathe, but he focused on the task at hand. There was a reason he had been chosen for this mission, and he wouldn't let his team down. Meanwhile, from a distant vantage point, Sophia Auralia, the alien girl, watched him through a pair of high-tech binoculars. Her violet eyes narrowed as she studied the human, his figure barely visible against the endless white of the snow. She had been observing him for hours now, confused by his determination, perplexed by his resolve. Sophia was part of the scouting team from the Solarian Empire, tasked with monitoring the human presence on their planet. She had heard much about humans, their unpredictability, and their resilience, but seeing it firsthand was something else entirely. To her, this human, David Miller, was just another oddity. His people, so small in comparison to her own, yet so stubborn and capable of unimaginable feats. She had watched him from the moment he arrived, setting up camp, ensuring every detail was perfect, and now, here he was, holding the ridge alone, against the forces of nature itself. What struck her the most was not the struggle, but the reason behind it. Humans, she had been taught, were motivated by things she could barely comprehend: loyalty, honor, and a sense of duty that transcended logic. These were emotions foreign to her kind. And yet, as she watched David continue to stand firm against the elements, something inside her stirred. She couldn't explain it, but it was there, an unfamiliar feeling. Perhaps it was respect, or perhaps it was something deeper, a curiosity that she couldn't shake. As the hours passed, Sophia found herself unable to look away. She had expected him to collapse, to abandon the ridge and find shelter, but he didn't. He stood there, unwavering, despite the harsh winds and freezing cold. Her people would have never lasted this long in such conditions, and yet this human seemed to thrive on it. It made no sense. There was something about his persistence, his ability to endure, that shifted something inside her. The more she watched, the more she found herself questioning everything she had believed about humans. It was a strange sensation, one that made her uncomfortable. She didn't know what to think. But for the first time, Sophia found herself wondering, what if there was more to these humans than she had been taught? What if they weren't just small, weak creatures, but something far more complex? The wind howled louder, and the snow began to fall in heavier sheets, but David didn't move. He stayed at the ridge, his reason for remaining firm in his mind. The longer she watched him, the more Sophia realized something important. She wasn't just observing him. She was beginning to understand him. The cold wind howled through the barren landscape, its icy fingers reaching out to claw at David's exposed skin. He barely noticed, his focus completely on the task at hand. His breath came out in visible clouds, but his body had long since grown accustomed to the chill. The ridge was his responsibility, and he would not fail. The storm intensified, the snow now swirling around him in thick, suffocating sheets. His gloves were soaked through, his body shivering from exhaustion, but still, he stood firm, his back straight against the howling force of nature. He had been here for hours, each moment stretching longer than the last. He had no idea how much time had passed, but he knew one thing: he could not leave. Not until the mission was complete. Sophia continued to watch from the distance. Her violet eyes narrowed, her heart beating faster than usual. She had been observing David for what felt like an eternity, her mind a whirlwind of confusion. She could feel a strange pull inside her chest, an unexpected stirring of something she had never felt before. In her world, emotions were controlled, measured, and calculated. But watching this human, his unwavering determination, was beginning to crack the armor she had built around herself. She shifted her position behind a cluster of rocks, her body still hidden, but her gaze fixed on him. It was then that she saw it, the moment that changed everything. David's body faltered. His knees buckled slightly as he took another step, and for a brief second, she thought he might collapse. But he didn't. He took a deep breath and stood taller, his eyes locking onto the horizon once more. His reason for staying here, in this unforgiving storm, became clearer to her in that instant. It wasn't duty. It wasn't orders. No, it was something deeper, something more primal. David stayed because he believed in something. He believed in the strength of his will, in the promise of what he was doing. He wasn't just enduring the storm. He was embracing it, allowing it to shape him, to test him. Sophia felt a flutter of something deep within her, something she couldn't explain. This human, this strange, fragile creature, had something she had never seen before. And it wasn't just his strength. It was his resolve, his unshakable belief in his purpose. The storm seemed to intensify, but David remained unmoved, rooted to the spot. The cold didn't matter to him. His clothes were soaked, his face red from the wind, but he kept going, step by painful step. Sophia's heart raced as she watched him. There was something about him that called to her, a depth she couldn't understand. And it wasn't just his physical endurance. It was the strength of his spirit. She had seen countless species, some stronger, some more advanced, but none had ever impressed her quite like this. No one had ever held her attention for so long. No one had ever made her feel so uncertain. She couldn't look away. David, the human she had once underestimated, was beginning to change her perception of her own kind. She had always thought of humans as weak, as lesser beings. But now, as she watched him stand against the storm, something inside her shifted. He wasn't weak. He was a force of nature in his own right. And that, she realized, was what made him dangerous. Dangerous to everything she had believed in. Dangerous to her carefully constructed world. And yet, the more she watched, the more she felt a connection she couldn't explain, an inexplicable bond that pulled her toward him. For the first time in her life, Sophia felt vulnerable, exposed. She had been taught to never show weakness, never to let anyone see her uncertainty. But now, as she watched David fight against the storm, she found herself questioning everything. Who was she, really? And what was it about this human that made her question her beliefs? The storm raged on, the snow now falling in thick, blinding sheets. David could barely see beyond the ridge, his vision blurred by the constant swirl of snowflakes and the piercing wind. His legs felt like they were made of lead, each step a battle against the freezing cold that seeped into his bones. Yet, he remained where he was, his hands gripping the rough stone beneath him as though the very ground beneath him was the only thing keeping him tethered to reality. There was something primal about this moment, something deep inside him that urged him to continue despite every signal from his body telling him to stop. He was no longer just holding a position. He was proving something to himself. The storm, the wind, the freezing cold, it was all just noise now. His mind was focused, and his purpose had never been clearer. Meanwhile, Sophia continued to watch from the shadows, her violet eyes trained on the human in the storm. She had been there for hours, and despite the biting cold, her body remained still, a silent observer of this strange, unyielding display of strength. Something inside her had shifted. She had come here to study humans, to observe their behavior, their weaknesses, but what she was witnessing now was not what she had expected. David Miller, this fragile, small creature, was showing her something entirely new. He was showing her resilience. The kind of resilience she had only read about in books, stories of mythical heroes who faced impossible odds and never wavered. But this was real. This human was real. And he was standing alone against the storm, not because he had to, but because he chose to. She felt an unfamiliar tightness in her chest. It was an emotion she couldn't name, but it was there. something warm, something that made her chest ache. She had never felt this way before. To be honest, she had never allowed herself to feel much of anything. Her life had been about control, about power, about keeping her emotions in check. But now, watching David, she felt something break inside her. She wanted to go to him, to offer him shelter, to pull him away from this madness. But she stayed rooted to the spot. She wasn't sure why, but she knew one thing. She couldn't interfere. Not yet. She didn't know what this was, what was happening to her, but she knew she had to figure it out on her own. As the storm howled louder, the cold biting deeper into his flesh, David stumbled slightly, his body beginning to fail him. His vision blurred even more, and his muscles screamed in protest, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Not now. Not after everything he had been through to get here. And then, just as the last bit of strength seemed to drain from him, he felt something shift. A warmth, like a soft hand on his back, pushing him forward, keeping him upright. It wasn't physical, but it was there, like a whisper in his ear telling him that he wasn't alone. He could do this. He could finish this. And somewhere, deep in the distance, he felt a presence, watching him, urging him on. It was only for a brief moment, but it was enough. Sophia's heart raced as she watched him. She didn't know why, but she was feeling something she had never felt before. Empathy? Concern? Or maybe it was something else entirely. Whatever it was undeniable. Her mind was still filled with questions, but one thing was certain. David Miller had changed something in her. And she couldn't look away. The storm began to ease, the snowflakes slowing their descent as the wind softened. The sky, once an impenetrable gray, now showed signs of breaking. David's muscles screamed in protest, but he remained on his feet, standing tall on the ridge. His eyes were unfocused, the exhaustion nearly overwhelming, but the quiet sense of purpose in his heart kept him going. He could barely feel his fingers anymore, but they still gripped the rocky outcrop, as though his body itself refused to let go. Somewhere, deep within him, a voice urged him forward, telling him that he was almost there. It wasn't the mission that had kept him here, not anymore. No, it was something else, something he had discovered within himself. Sophia, still hidden in the distance, continued to watch him. She couldn't tear her eyes away. The human was defying every expectation she had of him. His endurance, his tenacity, were beyond anything she had imagined. And the longer she watched him, the more she found herself grappling with a feeling she couldn't name. She had never encountered a being so determined, so unwavering in their will. It was a quality she admired, but it also unsettled her. It made her question her own resolve. For the first time, she wondered what it meant to truly fight for something. She had always been taught that strength came from control, from power. But this human was showing her a different kind of strength. One that came from within, from a place far deeper than anything she had ever experienced. The storm was almost gone now, but David's body was reaching its breaking point. He could feel the darkness creeping at the edges of his vision, his thoughts blurring. He knew he should rest, that he should seek shelter. But the thought of giving up felt worse than the physical pain. In that moment, the wind seemed to die down completely, and everything fell quiet. David blinked, his body trembling from the cold, his breath shallow and uneven. His heart pounded in his chest, but it wasn't from exertion. It was something else. The silence around him was deafening. Sophia's eyes narrowed as she sensed the shift. It wasn't just the storm that had changed. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Her instincts screamed at her to act, to move, but she stood frozen. She didn't understand it. She didn't understand him. She had been trained to observe, to calculate, but this was beyond calculation. This was something that transcended reason. David shifted his weight slightly, his eyes still locked on the distant horizon. His face was pale, his lips cracked from the cold, but he wasn't focused on the storm anymore. He was focused on the feeling within him, the quiet determination that had kept him standing all this time. It was a promise to himself, to those who had counted on him. A promise that no matter the cost, he would endure. Sophia's chest tightened as she realized something crucial. This human, this creature from a small, insignificant planet, was teaching her something. He wasn't just surviving. He was thriving, in his own way, in the harshest of conditions. He was living in a way she had never considered before, a way she couldn't explain. She wanted to understand it. She wanted to understand him. And for the first time, Sophia felt something stir deep inside her. It was a feeling she had long since buried, curiosity. David, still standing tall despite everything, didn't know that he had been watched all this time. He didn't know that his persistence had reached across the distance, pulling something, closer to him. He didn't know that he had, in his own quiet way, already made an impact. And somewhere, in the silence of the ridge, Sophia realized that she was no longer just observing. She was beginning to care. David's mind swirled in the fog of exhaustion, his body no longer responding with the same urgency it once had. Each breath felt labored, each heartbeat slow and heavy in his chest. He could feel the weight of the world pressing against him, but still, he stood firm. He had no intention of giving in, not when he was so close to completing his mission. The storm had quieted, but the cold still cut through him like a blade. His legs wobbled beneath him, the ice and snow beneath his boots slick and treacherous. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he thought he might collapse. But then, as though a second wind had taken hold of him, he pushed forward. He could hear the crunch of the snow under his boots, but it felt distant, like an echo from another world. He barely noticed it anymore. His focus was laser-sharp, directed toward the distant horizon that seemed to beckon him forward. A strange sense of peace had settled over him despite the agony in his limbs. He wasn't just enduring anymore. He was living in the moment, each step a testament to his will. As the snow finally began to slow, a soft, almost imperceptible silence fell over the ridge. David's body had reached its limit, but his mind, his spirit, was still as strong as ever. The silence was broken by the faintest sound, a soft breath, carried on the wind, like a whisper in the dark. David didn't know why, but he turned his head, scanning the area. His heart skipped a beat as his eyes locked onto something in the distance, a figure, barely visible, but unmistakable. His pulse quickened, and for a moment, he thought he had imagined it. But then, the figure stepped forward, moving toward him through the snow. It was Sophia. She was standing there, in the clearing, watching him. The realization hit him like a tidal wave. She had been there the entire time, observing him, silently. He wasn't sure how long she had been watching, but her presence now felt as real as the cold air in his lungs. He didn't know what to say, didn't know what to think. Sophia stood motionless, her violet eyes locked on him with an intensity that made his heart race. She was so different from him, yet at that moment, they shared something unspoken, but powerful. She had witnessed his struggle, his determination. He had never thought she would understand, never thought anyone could truly understand what it was like to push through the pain, to fight when everything inside you told you to give up. And yet, here she was, standing before him, her expression softening as she studied him. The cold wind howled again, the snow swirling around them, but it felt different now. It wasn't just the storm anymore. It was something else, something that connected them, even in this vast, empty place. Sophia's voice broke the silence, her tone quiet but steady. "You didn't have to stay," she said, her words cutting through the stillness like a gentle blade. David didn't know how to respond. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words felt foreign, trapped in his throat. Instead, he simply nodded, his breath shallow. There was nothing more to say. In that moment, everything between them seemed to click into place. The distance, the differences, the tension, it all melted away. They were no longer two beings from different worlds. They were just two people, standing together in the aftermath of something neither of them could fully understand. Sophia took a step closer, her eyes never leaving his. "Why did you stay?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with curiosity. David paused, considering her question for a long moment. He didn't have an answer, not one that made sense. But he knew one thing for sure. He had stayed because he had to. It wasn't about the mission anymore. It was about something deeper, something he had discovered within himself. "Because I had to," he finally said, his voice hoarse from the cold. "Because I couldn't leave, not when I knew there was still a chance." Sophia's eyes softened, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. It wasn't much, but it was enough. In that brief moment, something had changed. David didn't know what it was, but he knew that Sophia understood. And for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of connection, something beyond the mission, beyond the storm, beyond the cold. It was a connection he couldn't explain, but it was real. And in that moment, he didn't need to understand it. He only needed to accept it. The snow had finally stopped falling, and the wind, once a relentless force, had died down to a quiet murmur. David stood motionless, the weight of the moment pressing on him. He was no longer fighting against the storm, but rather standing in the stillness that followed, letting the silence wash over him. His muscles ached from the exertion, but he felt something else, something he hadn't expected to feel out here in the desolate cold. It was a sense of peace. As he glanced over at Sophia, standing nearby, he realized that despite the strange world around them, despite the differences that had once seemed so vast, they now seemed small in comparison to what they had just shared. Sophia, too, stood in silence, her violet eyes searching him with an intensity that mirrored his own. She had watched him endure the storm, seen the strength in him that had made her reconsider everything she had ever thought about humans. Her mind was still reeling, trying to make sense of the emotions that had been stirred inside her. She had always thought of herself as logical, pragmatic, but this human, this strange, stubborn creature, was showing her something completely different. It was a vulnerability she hadn't expected, an emotion that had crept up on her slowly and steadily. But now, standing there with him, she realized it wasn't just the storm she had been watching. It was him. She felt a pull toward him, an undeniable connection that had grown stronger as the storm raged on. The silence between them stretched on, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a quiet understanding, a shared moment that neither of them could quite explain. Sophia stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his. "You're different," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. David blinked, startled by the suddenness of her words. "Different?" he asked, unsure of what she meant. "In ways I don't quite understand," she replied, her tone soft but filled with something else. "I've never seen anyone like you before." David looked down at the ground for a moment, his mind spinning. He wasn't sure how to respond to her words. He had never thought of himself as different. He had always just been him. But hearing it from her, in this moment, made him realize that perhaps he was, in some small way, different. "I don't know what you see," he said slowly, lifting his gaze to meet hers. "But all I've ever tried to do is keep going. Even when it hurts. Even when everything tells me to stop." Sophia studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then, with a small, almost imperceptible nod, she said, "I see strength. And not just physical. Something deeper. It's not something I understand, but I can feel it." The words lingered between them, heavy and full of meaning. David didn't know how to process them, but he knew one thing. He didn't want this moment to end. He didn't want to go back to being alone. The thought of leaving this quiet connection behind seemed unbearable. But as the wind began to pick up again, a soft gust brushing against his skin, he realized that no matter what, this moment had changed him. He had been through so much in his life, but this feeling of being seen, truly seen, was something new, something that felt more real than anything he had ever experienced. Sophia took another step toward him, closing the distance between them. She wasn't sure what was happening between them, but she knew she couldn't turn away. Not now. Not after everything she had witnessed. The distance that had once felt so insurmountable was gone, replaced by a quiet understanding that neither of them had expected. They stood there together, in the silence of the storm's aftermath, no words needed. The connection between them was undeniable, and for the first time in a long time, both of them felt like they had found something worth holding on to. The silence between them lingered, stretching into something comfortable, something neither of them had ever expected. The air around them felt lighter, the weight of the storm that had once held them both in its grip now dissipating. David could feel the warmth returning to his body, not from the cold, but from the strange, undeniable connection between him and Sophia. He had never imagined this moment, never imagined that in the middle of such a desolate place, in such harsh conditions, he would find someone who made him feel seen. As the wind shifted, the chill still present but less biting, Sophia took a step back and glanced around. She seemed to be gathering herself, her expression still intense, but not as guarded as it had been when she first appeared. David followed her gaze, noticing for the first time how beautiful the landscape had become in the aftermath of the storm. The clouds had parted, and the setting sun cast a soft, golden glow across the snow, turning the world into something otherworldly. It was breathtaking. I don't think I've ever seen anything like this, Sophia said quietly, her voice carrying a depth of wonder that was rare for someone like her. David looked at her, his eyes searching her face, and for the first time, he saw not just the warrior, not just the observer, but someone who was, for once, truly present. I haven't either, he replied, his voice hoarse but steady. The silence returned, but this time, it wasn't filled with tension. It was peaceful, a moment of shared understanding. What happens now? Sophia asked, breaking the quiet. Her question seemed so simple, yet David felt the weight of it. What had happened now? They had survived the storm, both physically and emotionally, but that didn't mean the journey was over. Now, David murmured, looking at the horizon. Now, we figure out what comes next. Sophia's gaze softened, and she nodded slowly, as if weighing his words. There was something in her eyes, something that spoke volumes about the uncertainty she was feeling. She had never been one for uncertainty. Her life had always been about control, about knowing the outcome. But this was different. I don't know what that means, she admitted after a long pause. But I'm willing to find out. David turned to face her fully, taking in her words. It was strange to hear someone like her, someone who had always seemed so sure of herself, admit that she didn't know what came next. And yet, in that admission, there was a vulnerability that made him admire her even more. We'll figure it out together, he said, his voice firm, even though he didn't have all the answers. Sophia's eyes met his, and for a moment, the world around them seemed to fade away. There was no mission, no war, no reason for them to be here other than the quiet bond that had formed between them in the midst of everything. Together, she echoed, and for the first time, it didn't feel like an impossible promise. It felt like a beginning. The wind still whispered through the air, but now it carried something different, something hopeful. The storm had passed, and with it, something had shifted in both of them. David could feel it in the way his heart seemed to beat a little faster when he looked at her, in the way the silence between them no longer felt like an obstacle. It was a space where they could just be, together. And as they stood there, side by side, the world felt a little less cold, a little less lonely. The days that followed were quiet, the kind of peaceful stillness that David had never expected to find after the storm. The landscape, once a relentless battleground of snow and wind, was now calm and serene. The sky was clear, and the sun shone down, its light reflecting off the snow in a way that made the whole world sparkle. It was hard to believe that just days ago, the world had seemed so harsh, so unforgiving. Now, with Sophia by his side, everything felt different. Sophia, for her part, was still adjusting. She had never allowed herself to stay in one place for too long, never given in to the kind of stillness that David had come to embrace. But now, standing beside him, she found herself drawn to it. Drawn to him. It was a strange feeling, one that she wasn't sure how to process. She had always been about control, about having a plan, a purpose. But with David, it felt like she was learning to let go. Let go of the need to always have everything figured out. Let go of the armor she had built around herself for so long. They spent their days walking together, exploring the landscape, talking when words came naturally, and enjoying the rare moments of peace that had fallen over them. It wasn't just the quiet of the world around them that had shifted, it was something deeper, something unspoken. They didn't need to say much to each other anymore. The bond they had formed in the storm was enough. It was more than enough. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow, David sat down on a large rock, his body still aching from the days of travel, but his spirit lighter than it had been in a long time. Sophia, sitting beside him, glanced at him, her violet eyes reflecting the colors of the fading light. "What happens now?" she asked again, her voice calm, but carrying a weight of curiosity. David turned to her, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. He had been expecting this question, but he still didn't have a perfect answer. "Now, we keep moving forward," he said simply. "One step at a time." Sophia studied him for a moment, then nodded. "One step at a time," she repeated softly. It wasn't much, but in that moment, it felt like everything. The future was uncertain, and they both knew it. But for the first time, neither of them felt alone in it. The path ahead might be unclear, but they had each other. And that was enough. As the stars began to twinkle above them, casting their soft light across the snow, they sat in silence. the weight of the world easing for a while. The storm had passed, but something new had begun, something neither of them had expected. And for the first time in a long time, they were okay with not knowing what came next. The days that followed were a blur of quiet moments and shared glances. David and Sophia moved through the landscape together, the once frightening world now feeling a little more manageable. They hadn't spoken much more about what had happened in the storm. It was enough to know that they had both experienced something that had changed them. They still didn't know what lay ahead, but they didn't need to. They had each other. David could feel the difference in himself. The weight of the world, the responsibilities he had once carried so heavily, didn't feel as pressing anymore. It wasn't that they had gone away, but they felt more manageable now, with Sophia by his side. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel so alone in the world. Sophia, too, felt the change. She had always been the one to hold everything together, to maintain control in all situations. But here, with David, something in her had shifted. She didn't need to control everything anymore. She didn't need to have all the answers. She could simply be, and for the first time, that felt okay. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in soft, warm hues, they sat together by a campfire. The flickering flames illuminated their faces, casting shadows that danced with the wind. David looked at Sophia, noticing how the firelight reflected in her eyes, the subtle softness in her expression. She looked at him, her lips curling into a small, thoughtful smile. "Do you ever wonder if we were meant to meet?" she asked, her voice low and reflective. David considered her words for a moment. It was a question he hadn't asked himself, but now that she had posed it, it seemed to resonate deeply within him. "I don't know," he said honestly, his voice carrying the weight of uncertainty. "But I do know that I'm glad we did." Sophia's smile deepened, and she looked away for a moment, as though processing the depth of his words. It wasn't something she had expected, but there was a warmth in her chest, something that felt like acceptance, like belonging. "I think," she began softly, "that maybe I've spent so much of my life focused on what I could control that I forgot about the things that are beyond me. Things like connection." David's heart swelled at her words. He had never been one for grand declarations, but in this moment, he felt something profound. Something more than just survival, more than just a shared experience of the storm. It was something deeper, something they were both starting to understand. "I think I get that," he said quietly. They sat in silence for a while, the crackle of the fire the only sound between them. The world around them was still, as though the earth itself had paused to allow them this moment. Sophia turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze again, and for the first time, there was no hesitation, no walls between them. There was only understanding, a shared acknowledgement of the bond that had formed between them. "Whatever happens next," she said, her voice steady but filled with something new, "I think we'll be okay. Together." David nodded, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't a promise of certainty, but it was a promise of something real, something they could face together. The fire burned low, the last of the embers flickering out as the night settled around them. They sat there, side by side, no longer just two beings from different worlds, but two people who had found something in each other that neither had expected. And as the stars filled the sky above them, David knew, for the first time in a long time, that he had found a place where he belonged, a place where they both did.